Hey there, welcome back to the channel. My name is Andrew Clark, and in this video I want to talk about 5 ways that you can make your amp simulator pedal sound and feel a lot more like a real amp. So obviously I have the Universal Audio Dream here with me. This is the one amp sim that I still own, but these tips are gonna go for any amp simulator pedal. So if you have a Strymon Iridium or a Walrus ACS1, or even something like a Helix, these tips are still mostly going to apply. The main goal here is to cover a few things that you can do that are gonna make you feel like you have a real amp in your room rather than just a pedal on the floor. All right, let's jump into number 1. Okay, so first off, I want to talk about compression. Now, I've mentioned compression a ton of other times in a ton of other videos, but a compressor is super important for giving you that feel and that bit of a squish that an amplifier gives you. So any type of digital amp simulation, especially when it's set clean, to me, it always feels kind of stiff. And one of the best ways to kind of get rid of that stiffness is through compression. Now, obviously you can over compress and compression can feel more like an effect, but the way I want to use it here is much more subtle. So I'm a big fan of the Origin Effects Kali 76 Deluxe compressor, and that's what I've been using for a long time. But 2 other good compressors that do something very similar are the Wampler Ego compressor, and I think it's called the Jackson Bloom. That's another great one. The important thing that you want is a blend control, and this will allow you to keep a lot of your dynamics as you increase that compression to make it feel more like an amp. If you're not using a compressor with a blend control, it's just important to make sure that the compression is set pretty low. Okay, so let me show you what I mean here. I'm gonna turn the compressor off, and I have the Dream 65 set up just really clean. It's on the EV12 speaker. Bass and treble are straight up. The boost is just barely on, but it's set to the stock setting here. And then the volume is quite low, so we're getting like no breakup. We got no reverb, we got no trem. We are getting a little bit of reverb from the golden here just to make it feel like it's not so sterile. And yeah, it sounds like this. So that's just clean. Obviously there's a buffer at the front of the board, and then it's just going through the reverb and into the pedal. So it just sounds like a good clean tone, but I can feel there's a stiffness, and it's really hard to explain. It's one of those things that you really feel more than you hear. And when I kick on the Kali 76, you're gonna hear a bit of a volume bump, but that's not really the most important part. The most important part is how it's changing the feel of the notes when I play. So. Immediately, that just feels better. And honestly, I do this in front of a real amp too, and I think this is gonna be extremely noticeable if you play single coil, so a Strat or a Tele, you're gonna notice this right away. But even if you're using an amp sim pedal, I'd recommend even trying it with humbuckers a little bit. Maybe you're keeping the compression settings even lower and just barely having it blended in, but you have to experiment yourself and kind of see what works. These settings here on the Kali 76 for my guitar with humbuckers work perfect as well, so I don't have to change anything when I'm switching between guitars. Now, it's important to note that if you increase the gain from the pedal, so if you want to have a dirtier sound from the pedal, it is going to compress more. So obviously you're going to have compression from your compressor and then also from the pedal. So this is more of something, if you want to have like a clean pedal platform and you get a lot of like your gain from pedals, this is more of a tip for that. If you really want to crank the gain sounds coming from the pedal, then again, you're going to have to make sure that the compression is turned kind of to the right amount so that it doesn't get too squishy. I'm going to show you one more time just how the compressor affects things. So let's turn it off here and okay, so moving on to number 2, we're gonna talk about the heart of every good guitar tone, and that is overdrive. Now, this is where we get into some really subjective waters, because obviously we're not all searching for the exact same guitar tone. We kind of all have something different in our heads that we're all aiming for. So while compression doesn't add a lot of like tonal characteristics, your overdrive and your choice of overdrive has a huge one, especially in the way that it interacts with your guitar. So if you play a Strat through a tube screamer, that's gonna have a sound. If you play a Les Paul through a tube screamer, that's gonna have a sound. Same thing would go for a Telly through a blues breaker, or maybe a Gretsch through a Klon. And obviously you can mix and match all of those. So this isn't so much a way to say like, hey, use this overdrive to make your amp sim pedal sound better. The idea is more to find an overdrive that works very well with your guitar, the pickups in your guitar, and the amp sim pedal. So if you've watched any videos on this channel, you know that I'm an analog man, king of tone guy. As I've changed through different guitars and amps throughout the years, the king of tone has just kind of been a mainstay. It's something that's always been there for me. And the reason for that is because it just kind of has the tone that I'm after. And with every guitar and amp combo I've used, I didn't need those extra mids from something like a Klon or a tube screamer. So when I was spending time with the Strymon Iridium, I found that the Fender sound on that had a lot more mids. And so I found like the king of tone worked pretty well. But with the Dream, there are a lot less mids. So what that's made me realize is that if I want to get a consistent tone between my amp and the Dream 65, I'm gonna need an overdrive with a little bit more mid-range. Now that's just for me to get the sound that I like. For you, you might be used to a Fender Deluxe Reverb style amp, and you might like that there aren't as many mids there. And in that case, you're gonna wanna use something like more transparent, or something like a blues breaker circuit like the King of Tone. So I do have the Rockaway Archer here, which is a type of Klon clone, so it has more mids naturally than the King of Tone does. So I'll kind of let you listen to the difference. I'm gonna set them both pretty subtly like this. And let's just take a listen. So right away you can hear there's pretty big EQ differences. Obviously I have the EQ as exaggerated just a tiny bit on this pedal because that's why I like to set it. But it's not just about the EQ of the pedal either, right? Each one kind of breaks up in its own different way. And again, in combination with different amp sim pedals, you're gonna kind of find yourself liking one or the other. Typically, I'm always gonna go to the King of Tone when it comes to my EZG50, but in that demo right there, I feel like I would lean towards the Archer every single time. Again, it's just about experimenting and finding which overdrive works best in tandem with your guitar or guitars and your pedal. So when it comes to overdrive, obviously we talked about using the compressor as an always on, but I'm someone who always has an overdrive on. I'm never gonna be found with just the compressor on. What I kind of like to do is I leave my compressor on and then I pick and choose the overdrive or fuzz sound that I wanna go for and turn those on and off. But in a live scenario, I'd probably never be caught without one of those on. And the idea here is to use that overdrive not so much as like a distorted sound, but more as a way to kind of replicate real amp breakup. So the combination of your light compression with your light overdrive should give you the sound and feel of an amp that's kind of starting to break up. When you back off on your volume knob a little bit and you lighten up your touch, even with the overdrive and the compressor on, you should still be able to clean up a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is probably the biggest game changer, and that is impulse responses or IRs. So without getting too technical, an impulse response is basically like a digital emulation of a speaker and a microphone. And these are necessary for any type of digital amp solution. So the universal audio stuff, it all has built-in impulse responses, same with the Strymon Iridium, and just about everything else out there that's standalone is going to have impulse responses built in. However, you're not actually stuck with the impulse responses in the pedal. Almost all of these have some sort of way to bypass the cabinet emulation or speaker emulation, which allows you to use your own impulse responses. The Strymon Iridium even goes a step further and allows you to load your own impulse responses back into the pedal, so you can get rid of the ones that they have in there and you can use your own. I know that's a big step up, especially for the Strymon Iridium, because those impulse responses weren't the best when I tried them out. But even just for the sake of experimentation, even if I'm happy with some of the speakers in the Dream, I can bypass that and I can run run it into Logic and use Space Designer, is I believe what you use inside of Logic. I'm sure there's an equivalent in any other DAW, and load up any of my favorite Celestion IRs and they sound great. If you're looking for like a non-computer solution, so let's say you have a pedal like this and you want to use your own IRs with it and you don't have the Iridium or any way to load your IRs into the pedal, I believe TC Electronic makes a little impulse response loader, and you place that at the end of your chain and you would still be able to access all your favorite IRs. I should warn you that IRs are kind of a crazy rabbit hole, and because there's so many different options out there and they all have just like these minor differences, I'd recommend only getting into this if you're unhappy with the sound of your pedal. To give you an idea of what different impulse responses can do, I'm sure you're already familiar, but I can just show you here. If we have a clean sound set up, we can flick through. So you can hear it without moving any of the other knobs. It makes a really big difference. So that's definitely something you can look into if the compressor and the overdrive aren't really doing it for you. All right, so next up is a pretty obvious one, and it's EQ. Now this EQ can happen in two places. You can have EQ before the amp sim pedal, or you can have EQ being applied after the amp sim pedal. So for in front, the best way to do it is with an EQ pedal. I don't have a dedicated EQ pedal. The best that I have is the Rockway Archer, which has a built-in EQ, but it is an overdrive. But most pedals you'll have on your board will just have like a tone knob, maybe a treble and a bass knob if you're lucky. And those don't offer too much actual sculpting of your sound. I think it's really important if you're using an amp sim pedal to be able to sculpt that sound a little bit. Even though the amp sim is gonna have a bass, treble, maybe a mid as well, that doesn't mean that it's gonna be rolling off or adding the right bass frequencies or the right treble frequencies that you are after. And that's where a graphic EQ comes in, because you can cut or boost those before you even get to the amp sim. A lot of times I find bass frequencies are the hardest to control as a guitar player because you don't really want to have too much of it, especially in a live or a recording scenario. So what I can do is if I want to roll off the bass on the pedal, it's going to sound like this. Roll it back up. But if I want to cut 100 hertz, that's a totally different sound, right, than bringing down the bass there. Those are totally different frequencies. The same thing would go for something like the treble. If I'm going to, let me just put that back. If I'm going to roll down my treble like this, darkens it up a little bit, but I want to have more presence. So this is quite high up there. Again, those are totally different frequencies that they're affecting. And that's what I mean when I say it really gives you the ability to kind of sculpt the sound that you're after. And if the general EQ curve of your amp sim is something maybe you're not happy with or you feel like it could be better, a graphic EQ is a great way to go. The other option with EQ comes after the amp sim. And honestly, the best way to do this is kind of like in your DAW when you're recording. So like in something like GarageBand or Logic, where you would apply an EQ after your guitar signal has gone through everything and into the computer. And while this is going to be like a more effective form of EQ, it's kind of totally unrealistic if you're in a live situation. And if you're recording as well, you obviously want to have the best tone you can going into the computer before it even touches an EQ on the other side. Okay, so the last thing is ambience. When you have an amp in a room, you're not just putting your ear up against the speaker, right? What you're hearing is the sound bounce off the walls or whatever else is in the room. And this is what really makes a guitar amp feel like it's alive. So there are ways to replicate this, and a lot of amp sim pedals have some sort of room ambience or built-in spring reverb like the Dream 65 to get you kind of feeling more comfortable. But I think it's really important to make sure those effects are dialed in properly. So to give you an example, let's play through the Dream totally dry and listen to what this sounds. This is going to sound so weird. Okay, let's bring a little spring reverb in. Ooh, that's so weird. So the type of ambience I'm talking about is not some big chamberous reverb that's very noticeable when you kick it on. Even when the whole band's playing, you can hear that the reverb is there. That's a totally different thing. This is the type of effect that you wouldn't notice if it was on, but you would notice if you turned it off. It's designed to just kind of make your guitar sit inside of a mix a little bit better. So for me, I pretty much always have a spring reverb on no matter what my setup is. Now I'm usually playing through an amp, so I'm gonna get my spring reverb from the Golden. But if I'm playing playing with the Dream, then I would probably put a different setting on here, and I would turn this reverb on and just leave that as like my always on reverb on the amp. So let's turn this off. It sounds like this. And then if I want to kick on a bigger reverb, I would add that like this. And then when I turn it off, I'm still gonna have that little bit of ambience. You can experiment and you can try using a delay too. A really cool thing that I used to do a lot was use slapback. This one's gonna be a little bit aggressive. Set quite loud, but maybe you like using slapback and a little bit more of a subtle reverb just to kind of find that right feeling. But yeah, get out there, experiment with spring, plate, or hall reverbs and just kind of find the right natural ambience that feels right to you. Okay, so there you have it. There are 5 ways that you can make your amp sim pedal feel and sound more like a real amplifier. Now I'd like to know from you, is there anything that I missed? If you can think of any other good tips, please make sure you leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content like this, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. I upload a new guitar video every single week. With all that said, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.